Well, good morning. Thank you for listening to the Daily Devo. My name is Pastor Stephen Maccabee. I want to read today from Matthew 24, verse 14. Jesus gave an answer to the disciples' question. The question was raised in response to the statement that Jesus made. Keep that in mind. Now, the statement that Jesus made was startling. The temple and the city are going to be destroyed. Everything you see is going to be dismantled. It's going to be laid one brick on top of another. When the disciples heard that, they were wanting to know just what you would know. When is this going to happen? They looked at Christ and said, we want to know what will be the signs of your return. We want to be prepared. We want to be ready. And that's a pretty natural response to what Jesus said. Well, we've talked about 10 very distinct signs that Jesus gave. Within the first 14 verses of Matthew 24, we have identified 10 different signs, all of which are a warning of the approaching tribulation period. We've looked over the course of the last 6 or 7 weeks, but I want to take a snapshot today just to remind my viewers of the signs of the times, if you will, the signs that are significant in the return of Christ. Number 1, a time of deception. Matthew 24, verse 5. Number 2, a time of dissension, verses 6 and 7. Then there's a time of devastation, verse number 7. There is a time of disease, all sorts of pestilences and viruses, verse 7. There's a time of disasters, verse 7. There's a time of what we want to say death. We're going to talk more about that in the next few days. Verse number 9. In verse number 7, there's a time of disloyalty. And then, number 8, there's a time of delusion. Verse 11. People are going to be deceived. But there's a time of defection. Verse 12. But today, I want to look at the 10th sign. And that is a sign and a time of declaration. Now, this declaration, I believe, is going to be twofold. The Antichrist is going to come onto the scene, and he's going to declare some things about himself. He's God. The prophets of God, the great men who God has sent out, the witnesses, they're going to go out through the world and they're going to declare that God is on his throne. So, Jesus said that the proclamation is going to go out, the testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So these 10 things are events that we can expect to take place in the days preceding the rapture. I believe these are going to be in full bloom at the beginning of the tribulation. But here's the question today. Pastor Stephen, are these 10 things present upon us now? How do we know? How do we know that these things are here? Well, keep in mind, these 10 things are going to continue to rise and multiply as we progress into the tribulation. The first 3.5 years of the tribulation, as they unfold, these things are going to be greater and greater and more in bloom. The key to understanding how all this is going to take place is what the Apostle Paul said, and he described the day of the Lord, and he's talking about this particular time called the tribulation. Consider 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 1. Paul writes, "Now, brothers, about the times and dates, we do not need to write you," verse 2, he says in chapter 5. "For you know very well that the day of the Lord will be like a thief in the night. And it will come upon you suddenly," he says. "While people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come upon them. Suddenly, as labor pains upon a pregnant woman." And then Paul says they will not escape. I want you to notice what this passage says about the birth pains. You know, labor pains do not they do not begin suddenly and shortly. They come on over time, don't they? They occur increasing frequency until the baby is born. My wife and I have 8 children. For several weeks prior to her delivery, she was experiencing contractions. They're often referred to as Braxton Hicks contractions, otherwise known as false labor. And I remember several different times, especially in our first child or two, and my wife thought she was having a delivery, but it was false contractions. Through the pages of history, sometimes I wonder as I read history if the world hasn't been experiencing Braxton Hicks contractions in a real spiritual sense. Maybe we're experiencing them today in 2020. I don't know. Maybe we are and maybe we're not. When a woman who's expecting a baby experiences Braxton Hicks contractions, although that's not true labor, it does indicate that labor's coming. It does indicate that it's on the way. And in the same way, I think in historical context, these events that we see are all associated with the Lord's return, and it's pointing to the fact that Jesus is going to return. They're going to occur with increasing repetitions and increasing intensities until there's a build-up, an explosion of catastrophic events. I believe it's best to interpret Matthew 24, verses 1 through 15 this way, that these are the birth pains leading up to the tribulation. Do we see some of them now? Yes. How do we know? Well, open your eyes. These things are going to intensify. These things are going to cast its shadow on the tribulation. These things are going to happen. They're going to be in place, and they're going to ramp up and roar during the early days of the tribulation. They'll grow in intensity and they'll grow closer together. Now, Matthew 24, verse 15, Christ describes a major change in the intensity of the tribulation. So for the first 3.5 years, they're over. The first 3.5 years have been a time of peace. It's been experienced by joy. It's been kind of a pseudo peace. These signs are amping up, but by and large, the political landscape is peaceful. About halfway through the tribulation, the abomination of desolation that we've talked about occurs. And in that event, this was Daniel's term for it, the abomination of desolation. And in that event, it changes everything. See, up until that time, most people assumed the prophecy of Daniel had been fulfilled, right? If you remember our study and our talk about Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the Syrian king back in 175 BC. This evil king hated the temple, he hated the Jews, and he hated the sacrifices that the Jews did in the temple. So he invaded their land, he came in, he defiled the temple, he set up an altar and a pagan idol to Zeus. He sacrificed pigs on the altar. He makes a mockery of Jewish worship and Jewish ideology, and he puts down their religion. The people flee. A man by the name of Judas Maccabeus leads a revolt and overthrows Antiochus. Everybody thought that was the end, and everybody thought that was the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy until Jesus comes in the Gospels and he brings up this term again, and he's having this conversation with his disciples regarding the signs of the second coming, regarding the signs of his return, and he's indicating, as I have argued, that there's a double fulfillment of prophecy because he points backwards to Daniel's prophecy as he points forward to his own. Jesus said, "You have heard about the abomination of desolation that Daniel described, and you know what has happened historically. However, this is a foreshadow of what's to come in the future when the abomination of desolation spoken about by the prophet Daniel will occur again on a greater scale in the tribulation." And it's that event that triggers warfare, death, that will mark the great tribulation, the last 3.5 years that the Antichrist is on the scene in the world. So listen and let the reader understand. Out there, somewhere in the future, Jesus describes a man who in the Bible who's called the Antichrist. He will be a shrewd politician, a leader that grows in prominence. He will gain the attention of the entire world. He will write a peace treaty, break a peace treaty with the nation of Israel. He will set himself up as God in the temple, demanding to be worshiped by all mankind. He will end the Jewish sacrifices in the temple. He will desecrate the holy place. And this becomes utterly detestable to the Jewish people. They will soon realize that they were wrong, but it'll be too late. The prophet Daniel warned all about this in Daniel 11:31. And then again in verse 36. And then in chapter 12, verses 9 through 11. When this day comes, everyone will be required to worship the Antichrist. It'll be a difficult day. God bless.